Welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. My name is Scott Koenig, and I am a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. The MDE encourages teachers to lean into the rich and diverse history of our country and world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to work with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. LaKisha Simmons. Dr. Simmons will look through the life and times of Harriet Jacobs to explore Black women's experiences in slavery, women's anti-slavery activism, and the importance of source material such as slave narratives. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. LaKisha Simmons, a professor of history in women's and gender studies at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the lives, writing, and histories of Black children and families in the 19th and 20th centuries. She is an award-winning teacher for her work in the classroom, including the distinguished Arthur F. Thurnall Professorship Award, an award earned through nomination by students and peers for teaching excellence. Dr. Simmons encourages her students to look at primary source material and engage in project-based learning. Welcome, Dr. Simmons.
Hello, thank you so much. It's great to be with you all today. I am presenting on women's anti-slavery activism, the life and times of Harriet Jacobs. This is the third of 3 webinars, and the goal has been to introduce you all to Harriet Jacobs, her autobiography, which is called Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, which was written under a pseudonym, Linda Brent, and her activism. I've mentioned before, but I think Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is an excellent slave narrative to teach and to read. It has become increasingly popular among historians, and so far I have experienced that students love it and they actually read it. It's also easy to break up into incidents or just chapters because each chapter is its own little essay or story, depending on the chapter. The webinars also use Jacobs related primary source material as well as other primary sources to kind of draw out the wider world of the 19th century, including Black women in slavery and freedom and women's anti-slavery activism. So just to give you a heads up about where we are, the first webinar was about Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, how it came to be written by Harriet Jacobs, how it came to be forgotten. People by the 20th century believed it to be a work of fiction, and then how it was rediscovered by a historian, and how she was able to verify that it was true by uncovering all this amazing primary source material related to Harriet Jacobs and her life. Lecture 2 was on Black women and girls in slavery and freedom, focusing on Harriet Jacobs and other women and girls in similar situations to her. And then today I'm going to be talking about women's activism before and after the Civil War. I should really say before and during the Civil War, as turns out. Okay, so that brings us today, women's activism before and after the Civil War. And I would like to give you a quick outline of where we'll be headed today. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about timelines. So the 3 webinars I've offered so far have kind of moved both before, during, and after the Civil War. And I noticed in the question, somebody asked about timelines, like what unit would you teach this? So I want to address that. Part 2, we're going to be talking about traveling for the cause, so activists who traveled. And we're starting with Harriet Jacobs' brother, John Jacobs, and Captain Jonathan Walker. I know they're not women, but I couldn't help it. And then part 3 will be Rochester, New York, how place influences activism. Next, we'll talk about the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Society. And the next part will be on refugee or contraband camps during the Civil War. And then hopefully I'll have some time to offer some brief takeaways about what I think we learned about anti-slavery activism from these case studies. Okay, part one, timelines. So the question that somebody asked was, what units would you teach this information in? And I think that's a really important question, especially related to teaching. I want to start just by saying that in my classes, I often really try to break down students' notion of historical timelines by focusing in on people. And I think what happens when we do that is that we see how long, like, people live a long time, but they can also live like across different historical time periods. And so that's why, for example, that people forget that Harriet Tubman lived in the 20th century, even though we think of her as like a slavery person. And it's also a reason why people think that slavery is, and even things like segregation are so far away, even though people who grew up, raised their children in segregation are still alive today and have those memories with them. One family that I do research on, the woman that I write about, she was born in slavery. She was a teenager during emancipation. And as an elderly woman, she moved in with her son and his children. When she was elderly, the youngest granddaughter of the family was in her teens when she passed away. And that granddaughter, who was raised in part by a grandmother who had been raised during slavery, passed away in 2021. And so it's kind of blows our mind to think that somebody who was raised by someone who was raised in slavery would have just passed away during the pandemic. So I just tell that story to have us think also not just about timelines, but about people, about generations. That being said, timelines are very important, and I very much appreciate that you all teach them. And it's easier for me as a college professor to break them down if the students actually know them. So I'm just offering here a little note about where I would teach some of this material. So Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl actually takes place during slavery, and Harriet Jacobs is writing it in the 1850s. It gets published in 1860. So it's very squarely a slavery autobiography. There is the end section where she talks about the coming of the war. So she talks about the Fugitive Slave Act. There's a chapter on the Fugitive Slave Act, for example, that would be great to teach in the coming of the war, and you could just teach that chapter. But for the most part, I think it is pretty much a slavery autobiography. And then in some of my other webinars, I gave examples of people, enslaved people who were able to buy their own freedom. One of them was Elizabeth Keckley. So that would be a great example from slavery. And then for coming of the Civil War, there's a lot of abolitionist material that you could teach. We're going to talk about Jonathan Walker today and some of the anti-slavery societies. And then for Civil War, we're going to talk today a little bit about contraband and refugee camps, or contraband or refugee camps. I usually call them refugee camps. And then the other thing we're going to talk about is missionaries and activists during the Civil War. And so that's something that you could throw into Civil War lessons that brings in gender in some really important ways. And then finally, if you're teaching Reconstruction, refugee camps also fit in Reconstruction, and some historians have called them rehearsals for Reconstruction. And so they were where the Freedmen's Bureau really started and how the federal government started thinking about what are we going to do with free people. In the last session, I talked about information wanted ads that were free people looking for their lost family members that they had lost during slavery, that they had been sold away from, their mothers, their siblings, their loved ones. And the advertisements are great primary sources for thinking about Reconstruction and the post-Civil War years. Okay. So that's just a little bit of a timeline, but now I'm going to go back to just being crazy. I apologize. Okay, so today's topic is activism, Harriet Jacobs and her circle of activist friends and family. Traveling for the cause. I wanted to talk just briefly about John S. Jacobs and his friend, Captain Jonathan Walker. John S. Jacobs was Harriet Jacobs' brother. He also wrote a slave narrative. It was very short in serialized form, and it appeared in the magazine The Leisure Hour. He traveled to talk about the evils of slavery alongside a friend of his, Captain Jonathan Walker, who was an abolitionist and sailor. Some of you might know Captain Jonathan Walker. He actually moved to Muskegon, Michigan at some point in his life, and it's where he died. And on this page is a blurry-ish image of a memorial that's at his cemetery. He was caught in Florida trying to help free fugitive slaves, and he was arrested, put into solitary confinement, and branded on his hand with the brand SS, which stood for slave stealer. In this photograph, because of the technology of the photograph, the SS is backwards, the one on the screen. And so he became a very powerful speaker against slavery and traveled the country telling his story once he was freed from slavery. And his hand became really well known, as well as this image, which circulated in anti-slavery circles. And so even though he had slave stealer sort of branded on his hand, a poet, Jonathan Whittier, wrote a poem called The Branded Hand that actually changed that to salvation to the slave. And so in abolitionist circles, his hand was known as salvation to the slave. And the poem says, then lift that manly right hand, bold plowman of the wave, its branded palm shall prophesy salvation to the slave. I've never been to his memorial, but I want to go. And you can see on it, it was actually put there at the time of his death. So it's not a modern day memorial, but you can actually see they put his like a likeness of his hand on there. That's what that little thing is. So I would love to go there and see it. So Jacobs and Walker traveled together to talk about anti-slavery activism. And some of the primary sources we have about that tells us a little bit about what it was like to travel for the cause. So in a notice in the North Star newspaper, there was a notice that said anti-slavery meetings. Jonathan Walker from Florida and John S. Jacobs from North Carolina will address the people at the following named places and times. Will the friends of humanity at those places make the necessary arrangement and assist them from place to place? And then it goes on to list the days and the cities. Well, they were really towns, they're pretty small towns, the days and the towns that they were visiting. And I just love this advertisement because basically what they're saying is they're just going to be traveling from town to town, and they're really relying on the goodwill of the people in those towns to house them, to help them, provide places for them to speak, usually in churches, and also to help them get from place to place, right? And that could be actually quite dangerous. And in fact, there were many times when Jacobs and Walker encountered towns that were hostile to abolition and hostile to their message, or churches that they would go to where they wouldn't allow them to speak. And so they often wrote about this in their letters, how difficult this kind of travel, sort of anti-slavery activism travel was. And then here in a letter to Garrison, John Jacobs writes, Jonathan Walker and myself on Saturday night, we spoke to the people at H, which was Hannibal, New York. The next day, we walked 11 miles through the snow with our bag of books on our backs and no dinner to meet the appointment at Cato. Then he went on to describe a hostile reception at the church. And so you can hear in that letter how difficult this kind of activism would have been during the 19th century. Firstly, they're walking. Secondly, the weather's not great. And thirdly, they're doing it with no real expectation that they'll be met with applause or, a warm place to stay. So it just goes to show, one, their dedication, but two, also how hard it was to do this kind of activism back in the 19th century before all of the technological advances that we have access to today, which I really like to point out to my students when I'm teaching this material. Okay, next part is Rochester, New York, how place influences activism. And so in this section, I just want to explore this question: how does space and place influence activism? Why might Rochester be important to the anti-slavery story and to Harriet Jacobs' own decision to write her story and to become an anti-slavery activist? One thing it's important to note in reading Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, we see right away that Harriet Jacobs has a very theoretical mind. She's thinking about things like, what is slavery? What is freedom? What does it mean to own yourself in this world, and what kinds of decisions you can make? So I don't want to make it seem like the only reason she became an activist was because she spent some time in Rochester, New York, but I do think it's really important to the story. So this is a historical marker that you can find in Rochester, New York, that talks about the neighborhood Child's Basin, and it says Center of Activism. And this neighborhood was incredibly important. All together, sort of clustered around the same area, are these very important anti-slavery spaces and women's rights activism. And I probably should throw in there, spiritualism was really popular at the time, and a lot of these people intersected in their women's rights activism, in their spiritualism, and in their anti-slavery activism. So, and I'll sort of return to this in a second, but I want to try, for those of you who can see the screen, I would like to sort of zero in on this neighborhood a little bit. So here we have just a couple of blocks, really, where there's all these important sites. I want to point out, sort of right here in the middle of your screen, you'll see point 5 and point 6. Point 6 is a business building that held the North Star newspaper, which was Frederick Douglass's newspaper. And this says Harriet Jacobs Anti-Slavery Reading Room, was her and her brother's anti-slavery reading room, which was essentially a library that people could go to read tons of anti-slavery material, newspapers and magazines as they came out, to help with the circulation of anti-slavery ideas. And then right across from that is another business area, Reynolds Arcade, which was a location for Black-owned businesses, but also was a site where a lot of anti-slavery bazaars were held by different anti-slavery societies and anti-slavery women's societies in particular. And so you can see how close a lot of this activity was. And then a couple blocks away, it's really only like a block and a half, 2 blocks away, is this site was Amy Post's house. Well, Amy and Isaac Post, who were important anti-slavery activists and really close friends with Harriet Jacobs. Indeed, she stayed with them for a while in their house when she was in Rochester. And so this is on the screen is a picture of Reynolds Arcade, and then just a historical marker about the Post house. The Post house was a place on the Underground Railroad. They hid fugitive slaves. As I mentioned, Harriet Jacobs stayed with them for a while, but it was also a really important site for activism. There you had Amy and Isaac Post, who were both radical Quakers and feminists, and very explicitly political and radical. They really embraced interracial mingling. So they had a lot of friendships that were interracial, and they kind of boasted about their radicalness, right? That it was very important to them that their activism included everyone. At their house, they were two of the people who started the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in 1842. It was interracial, so it had both Black and white abolitionists in it. It was mixed sex, so it had both men and women in it. It was explicitly feminist. It was started by many radical Quakers. They ended up leaving the Friends after a while because they were about to get thrown out. But they also organized anti-slavery fairs. Their anti-slavery fairs were meant to raise money, so they would sell goods, household goods, all of these things, with the idea that they would get a lot of money to help fund anti-slavery activism. Unfortunately, Amy Post was not a terribly successful fundraiser, but she was very successful politically. And in fact, she used to say, I don't care if I make money. The point is to get people into the door to buy things. And then we talk to them about anti-slavery activism. So for her, that was really, really important. And the other just important point, if you missed webinar 1 or don't remember, that Amy Post is the one who really convinced Harriet Jacobs to write her autobiography. She's the one who told her that you could do it and you should tell your story. And so Amy Post and Harriet Jacobs, even after she left Rochester, corresponded a lot about what this autobiography would be like and whether or not Harriet Jacobs felt comfortable writing it. And then I mentioned also the anti-slavery reading room that Harriet Jacobs worked at. In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she says she got a letter from her brother, William. His pseudonym in the book's name is William. In real life, his name is John Jacobs. She says, I found a letter from my brother. He thought of opening an anti-slavery reading room in Rochester and combining it with it the sale of some books and stationery, and he wanted me to unite with him. We tried it, but it was not successful. We found warm anti-slavery friends there, but the feeling was not general enough to support such an establishment. I passed nearly a year in the family of Isaac and Amy Post, practical believers in the Christian doctrine of human brotherhood. They measured a man's worth by his character, not by his complexion. The memory of those beloved and honored friends will remain with me to my latest hour. So part of what she's saying is that she found friends and community support. She built confidence while she was in Rochester. And I also think that the reading room was incredibly important because it gave her time to read widely and to think through some of the issues of the day, the politics, and then the questions around what is slavery, what is freedom, what will the future of America be? The atmosphere then of Rochester wasn't, as she said, there was not enough anti-slavery people to support, like a whole business. But what she did find was a ton of friends and community that helped her imagine what her activism and contribution could be in the future. Okay. So this next part is on the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Society. They eventually dropped sewing out of their title and just became the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. And they were active from 1851 to 1868. So you can see in that time period, they were active in the 1850s, sort of in the lead up to the Civil War. And then all the way until 1868. And they did a lot of activism during and directly after the Civil War. They were founded in 1851, and unlike the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society by Amy Post, this group was small, it was all white, and it was pretty elite. The women were middle class or upper class who were part of the group. And so it was a smaller circle of women. Their main goal was to fundraise for Frederick Douglass and his newspaper. His famous What is 4th of July to the Slave speech, they helped fundraise for the speech and put it on and print it. But also during the Civil War, they did fundraising for freed people in Virginia, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I think it's really important to note that, at least at the beginning, they did not position themselves as political in the same ways that Amy Post and her group positioned themselves. They wanted their work to be mainly religious philanthropy, and that would be how they would move the needle on anti-slavery activism. And their founder, who's Julia Griffith, said, "I am not a woman's rights or public speaker." And what she was really trying to say is that she's not one of these abolitionists who are looking for a public audience to be a public kind of woman, a political woman in the public sphere. That's not her goal. And that she was not for women's rights, or this group was not going to overlap with questions about women's suffrage or women's rights. And so she was really clear from the beginning that this group was supposed to be sort of apolitical in that way and to be more philanthropy based. It's, of course, maybe a false distinction to call them apolitical when they're working against the system of slavery. Obviously, they were political. But this was their stance. And of course, if you contrast them with Amy Post and her radical group, they do seem a little bit more conservative. So it really depends on, who you're comparing them with, about whether or not they're political. But maybe the question is more, how are they political, right? And by saying that they're staying in the women's sphere, but only helping through fundraising and not through public speaking and all of this, that's the way that they made that distinction. And maybe we can even see that in their original name, which was the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Society, right? Which is very gendered in a way. So Julia Griffiths was a wealthy woman from England who came to America because she saw Frederick Douglass talk in England and she was amazed and wanted to help him right away. And so she actually moved to Rochester because of Frederick Douglass. And she was known as a fundraising maven. In fact, her kind of conflicts with Amy Post, I think, really started because Amy Post's anti-slavery bazaars were not making a ton of money. Meanwhile, Griffiths comes in, throws a big bazaar, and makes a lot of money right away. And of course, Frederick Douglass was really appreciative of those funds. And so, although he had been close friends with the Post, all of a sudden he was turning to this other group because they were the ones that were really making the money. The items produced for their bazaars and their anti-slavery fairs were produced at home and assumed to be apolitical, but of course they had a public purpose and meaning when they were sold for profit in settings designed to encourage consumption and the exchange of money. So should these wealthy middle-class women really be engaged in what is clearly a commercial activity? And so here we are pushing again against this idea that they're apolitical and just staying in their own sphere, right? Sure, they're like making home goods at home, but then they're selling them for profit to make money, to be successful in the economic sphere. So by pulling upon their religious and moral duty, these abolitionist women blurred gender expectations between public and private surrounding commercial activity and economics, probably more so than they did around things like public speaking. I could say more about Julia Griffiths, but I think I'll move on. If we have time afterwards, I could say more. And we will return to the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society before the end. Okay, so part 5 is about refugee camps. And this is a picture actually on the screen, if you can see it. This is a picture of the refugee camp in Alexandria, Virginia, where Harriet Jacobs decided to volunteer during the Civil War. Contraband and refugee camps are really important piece of Civil War history. I don't know if you all are teaching it. I never learned it in high school or undergrad. And frankly, we didn't talk about it much in grad school either. But a lot of new books have been coming out about the contraband camps, and a lot of people are working on them now, including myself. I have a chapter on contraband camps in the book that I'm working on now. And they're so, so important. So during the Civil War, formerly enslaved people self-emancipated. They left their plantations and their places of enslavement. And because of the upheaval of the war, they just up and left and moved en masse towards Union lines. And so at every place where you could find the Union Army, you started to find these large bands and groups of freed people who had come there sort of seeking their freedom. This caused havoc and forced the issue of emancipation for Union officials. So at first, these people, these humans, were called contraband because they were legally owned by their enslavers, and they were treated almost as if they're the same thing as the property of any rebel household, right? Like their horse or, the food inside their house. And at first, a lot of the soldiers, they were told by the federal government, by the Union officers, that they had to send the people back. that caused a lot of problems. I mean, for one, it's not that easy to send people back who came of their own free will, right? So it wasn't so easy to just give people back. And it was probably impossible, let's just be clear. But it also caused huge problems because the soldiers were being faced with this mass of humanity. And at the same time, they were writing home, like, there's these people coming. The soldiers treated these people varying ways. Some treated them meanly, some treated them very kindly, some were really astonished at what they found. And so when they were writing back home to their loved ones, to their family members who were also at home getting all this abolitionist anti-slavery content, you know, and hearing about the evils of slavery, they would be like, oh my gosh, you cannot send those people back. And they started writing their representatives, their governors, all these people to say, like, our soldiers from Michigan, our soldiers from Massachusetts, wherever they were from, are not going to engage in sending these people back. And it really pushed the issue of emancipation to the forefront. And this is really the situation out of which the Emancipation Proclamation comes from, because you already had hundreds of thousands of people pushing the issue. And so when some people say the slaves freed themselves, this is kind of the context in which they're talking about, right? So they cause all this havoc, and the Union Army is having to really think about, like, how are we going to deal with this situation that we have on our hand? So some historians have said that there were over 200 camps across the United States. And pretty much as soon as this starts happening, and as soon as the Union takes over some territory, missionary and activists travel to attend to the free people right away. They're coming in the midst of war to open schools, to work as nurses, and to do on-the-ground activism. The conditions in the camps were pretty terrible. They were crowded. There was a lot of disease. There was a lot of death. It was not a great place to be. And there's some disagreement or discussion among scholars about, like, is this really freedom? And some people who were at the refugee camp said, this is worse than, you know, the conditions I had when I was enslaved. So I think the refugee camps are really interesting to learn about, because they help us think about the ways in which these people were so full of hope about what freedom could look like. And it was this moment where nobody knew what was going to happen. They didn't even know who was going to win the war, at least at the beginning, right? But they came to the Union Army really in hopes that it would change their life. And another scholar has said about the refugee camps, which I think is really powerful, that these were the places where new regimes of power were being mapped out, right? And it was the Union, it was the missionaries, and it was the formerly enslaved people, all sort of negotiating, like, what is freedom going to mean? What kind of work are we going to do? How are our families going to get taken care of? And these were the places where those questions were being worked out. So in Alexandria, Virginia, Harriet Jacobs comes there. She also was in Georgia for a while, but she wrote about her experience there while she was there. And I'll just read a little piece of that. She said, I think this was actually in a letter to Amy Post, and Amy Post sent it to a newspaper to print it. So that's how we have this letter. She says, since I last wrote to you, the condition of the poor refugees has improved. During the winter months, the smallpox carried them off by the hundreds, but now it has somewhat abated. At present, we have 140 patients in the hospital. The misery I have witnessed must be seen to be believed. The Quakers of Philadelphia who sent me here have done nobly for my people. They have indeed proved themselves a society of friends. Had it not been for their timely relief, many more must have died. They have sent thousands and tens of thousands of dollars to different sections of the country, wherever these poor sufferers came within our lines. But notwithstanding all that has been done, very many have died from destitution. It is impossible to reach them all. Government has erected here barracks for the accommodations of 500. We have 1,500 on the list. So I said I was going to return to the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. And that is because they were one of the groups that were sending funds to the refugee camps and to Alexandria, Virginia in particular, and working with Harriet Jacobs in particular. This is a picture of Julia Wilbur, a lot of Julias. This is a picture of Julia Wilbur, and she was working together with Harriet Jacobs at the Alexandria, Virginia camp. So they were two of the women missionaries there. Julia Wilbur, so the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society has their documents all located at the Clements Library, which is one of the archives at the University of Michigan, located at the University of Michigan, and all of their stuff is digitized. So I'll just put a note out for the Clements Library, which is a great resource. And they're very great if you email them to ask them questions. I find they have great educators there. I like to take my classes there a lot. And they're doing some work with high school teachers this summer. So they're doing a lot of really cool things. Anyway, so they have some letters from this time period that are part of that collection that are from Julia Wilbur in particular and about her time working at the refugee camp. One of the things that she said when she was working at the refugee camp is, "I have not regretted for a moment that I came, because a woman's presence more than anything is needed among these poor creatures." One historian has pointed out how, I guess, racialized that comment was, because there actually were women there. There was a group of Black church women who were doing activism there. Of course, there were the freed women themselves who are also women, and Harriet Jacobs. But Julia Wilbur felt really alone, like she was the only one, and saw that her presence was really needed, I guess, as a kind of civilizing influence, it would be fair to say. So we see from her letters that at first there was some conflict between herself and Harriet Jacobs. At first, when Harriet Jacobs was sent to work with her, the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, who many of them actually knew Harriet Jacobs from her time in Rochester. So she hadn't been living in Rochester for like 10 years. But when she goes to work, when she gets sent down to this place, they start sending a lot of their funds, and they would also send boxes of goods like clothing, blankets, everything that these people would need, right? And they would send it to Harriet Jacobs to keep track of and then give out. And so Julia Wilbur, who came from the society herself and was like, wait a minute, this was my job, got really upset. Basically, it was like, how could you give that job to a Black woman? She didn't say it like that, and maybe it would be unkind of me to phrase it like that, but she was not happy. And so you could see that kind of conflict bubbling up in her letters at first. Some scholars have noted that a lot of the white missionaries kind of took on this role of mother or even as mistress as part of their role of like taking care of all these formerly enslaved people and formerly enslaved children in particular, and kind of reveled in that role of being able to be in charge in that way. And I think Julia Wilbur, at least at first, was in that category. It's really important to say that as her and Harriet Jacobs worked together, they became close friends and stayed friends for the rest of their lives, which, I mean, under the extreme kind of traumatic circumstances of a refugee camp, that's not surprising. And so one of the things that I will say is that some of the people had these conversations in the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society about how important Julia Wilbur was to the cause and why it was so important to have a white woman there. And Julia Griffith, the woman, the wealthy woman who started the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, wrote specifically about this topic to tell people, yo, back off of Harriet Jacobs. She said, I cannot, my friend, agree in what you say of Miss Wilbur going where no colored woman can go and doing what no colored woman can do. A colored woman should have had the opportunity before anyone ventured to say she could not do it. My views are strong on this subject, and I feel they are the right views. If you send a second teacher, pray, try and find a suitable colored woman. The New York Friends have sent the right person in Harriet Jacobs. And so you can see the conflict that bubbles up in the letters was also circulating among the activists themselves. And they were kind of gossiping about the situation, like, what's going on here? And Julia Griffith's like, no, actually, this is a job for Black women too, and maybe Black women in particular. Jacobs also argued for Black autonomy. And so there was a point in Alexandria where the freed people started to get upset about the school that they had started. And they were like, we want some control over the things that are going to be taught and the teachers that you're going to choose. And they wanted to have a say in how the school was run. And so Harriet Jacobs helped them organize to have a meeting to be able to put in their input. And they ended up electing two teachers, one who was white and one who was Louisa Jacobs, Harriet Jacobs' daughter. And so those were the two teachers that were helping to run the school. And this is just a picture, if you can see the screen, this is just a photograph of one of the refugee camps in Virginia. This is at Cumberland Landing in 1862. I'm getting this from my daughter who knows something about Cumberland Landing. It was a half day today. One of the things I really wanted to share with you is this really interesting, I find inspiring memorial called the Contrabands and Freedmen Cemetery Memorial, which is in Alexandria, Virginia. The memorial opened in 2014. It is at the site of the cemetery at the refugee camp that Harriet Jacobs worked at. It's brand new in the sense, I mean, 2014, that's really recent. And in fact, the site of the cemetery was on local maps in Alexandria until the late 1930s. I think around 37 or 39 was the last time the cemetery was on a map. And then it kind of got lost, forgotten about, built over. There was a gas station right next to the site. It's also right next to the freeway. And it was completely forgotten. And then in the 1980s, it was rediscovered by some local historians and archaeologists. And they started to do the research about what is this burial ground that we found here. And so because of their work, they started to get together and find primary sources related to the cemetery, related to the refugee camp. They started to find and try to gather local descendants of people who had spent time in that refugee camp. and worked together to get this memorial built. And so now you can see, and it's a really moving place to me, but it's super small. Like I said, it's sort of smushed next to the freeway. It's not Rand, but they've done such a wonderful job. And so the city of Alexandria has a website that's related to this memorial. It has a virtual tour. It has videos about the history of the refugee camp. It has a few primary sources available, even some oral history interviews that were done with descendants. The virtual tour is one of those Google tours, so you can kind of go around and look at the different images, but you can also read and see some of the sculptures from up close. So part of it includes, there's this huge sculpture that's called the Path of Thorn and Roses, I think, that has like formerly enslaved people kind of, I guess, moving, crawling up it towards freedom. But then it has these walls that have, here you can kind of see a list of people who are at the refugee camp. They have markers for when living descendants were found. They have this image of the school that Harriet Jacobs worked at. They have some quotations from Jacobs herself. And then they've cleaned up the cemetery and put new markers on the ground where they can. They have lists of people who are buried in the cemetery. At first, the Black soldiers were also buried there, but at some point they were moved to official veterans resting places. So it's only the women and the children and the civilians who were at the refugee camp. One of the things that Harriet Jacobs wrote about in her time there, she was writing about the children who she saw at the refugee camp. And she said, those tearful eyes often looked up to me with the language, is this freedom? Right? I think it returns us to the question that Harriet Jacobs leaves us at the end of Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, which was published before this. But at the end of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she says, reader, my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way, marriage, but with freedom of my person. And she says, that's only as good as what freedom can be. I'm as free as anybody is in the North, but how good is that really? Kind of question mark. And so she's still writing in a way that's making us or forcing us to think about what is freedom, right? And what is freedom for these people who are searching for what life after slavery is going to be like? Is it going to be poverty and disease, right? Or are they going to have opportunity? So I think that's one of the reasons why I love teaching about Harriet Jacobs, because she is so theoretical. But I think it really helps us think through these different time periods. When Harriet Jacobs said it in 1860, or when it was published in 1860, and she was saying, what is freedom to women of the North? She was asking about what is freedom when you have to live under a fugitive slave law? What is freedom when you are a woman in this society? What is freedom if you don't have a job that you can support yourself in? I think she was asking all those questions. But when she's writing during the Civil War and she's, looking at all these formerly enslaved people at these refugee camps, I think her question is also like, what is freedom going to be during this period of Reconstruction, right? How will the federal government help support and transition these folks from slavery into freedom? And will it be just as bad, or will there be opportunity for more? So she's asking those questions in really pertinent ways for both of these time periods. Okay, I wanted to try to end with a couple of takeaways about women's anti-slavery activism, since that's what this webinar was supposed to be about. I think there's maybe a lot of takeaways from today, but I'm just going to offer these about activism. So one of the things we learned about was about traveling and giving talks, that kind of work was dangerous, treacherous, and depended on the goodwill of others. It wasn't like, putting your message out on Twitter. We also learned about people who were really, really invested in radically rethinking the social order from top to bottom. And our example of that was Amy Post, who was really dedicated to interracial activism, feminist activism, and pushing boundaries and borders of all kinds. I guess as a spiritualist, she was also interested in the boundary between the living and the dead. Sorry, just a little spiritualism joke. She also was really into salons, housing fugitives, making friends across boundaries and borders. That was a real huge part of her activism. She tried to raise money, and she really wanted to convert people to her causes. We also learned about how important building community could be, really the importance of the local, right? The story of Rochester is a story that activism can happen at the super local level, and that super local level is really important for like energizing and spreading activism, but also sustaining the activism, activists themselves, that those friendships that they made sustained them for years, even though and when they were fighting with each other, perhaps. We also learned about wealthy funders, right? That not all of these activists saw themselves as radicals, although they probably all were radical in their own way. But so the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society is a good example of that, where they saw their role as mainly raising funds and staying a bit more apolitical, even if they weren't totally apolitical. And that their donations became really helpful, both before the war, but also during the Civil War, when they did not back out of the activism that they had been doing, and instead you really focused on giving clothing, funds, blankets, medicines, and materials to freed people on the ground, as well as supporting Julia Wilbur and other missionaries who were there. And then we also learned a little bit about missionaries during the Civil War, the teachers, the nurses, the on-the-ground organizations that helped the free people and helped give them not only medical care, but also build schools, which was an incredibly important site of organizing around the freed people that was seen as incredibly important to the Black communities themselves. They wanted these schools. They showed up. They sent their kids. The adults came to learn when they could. And so all of the missionaries who came as teachers and nurses were seen as hugely important in helping to support, sustain, and start a large number of these schools that the freed people continued on after the Civil War. And in fact, it's said, African Americans raised like $1 million to sustain their schools after the Civil War. And these were people who had been enslaved. So the schools were incredibly important. And Harriet Jacobs and her daughter Louisa were important workers in that story. Right. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. This is amazing. I really appreciated the joke too in the end. So just the content, amazing. I thank you for sharing your practice with us as well and modeling what teaching and learning can look like when it comes to this content. So we thank you. We sincerely appreciate you sharing your content knowledge with us throughout this entire webinar series.